There's a Waitrose on Botley Road, Oxford. Last month, the shelves went quiet. Someone taped up a notice apologising. They'd run out of beer. Waitrose doesn't run out of things, but it ran out of this. A lager brewed by a 65-year-old former TV presenter from his own barley beat one of Britain's best supply chains. That presenter has a name: Jeremy Clarkson. 300 miles north, a Durham pub is ripping out its taps for his beer. Clarkson is now one of the most dangerous men in British brewing. Today we'll tell you why. Every big story needs an unlikely beginning, and this one begins with a subsidy cheque that got smaller. Back in 2021, Clarkson was sitting on a farm he'd bought more or less on a whim, watching the government quietly wind down the agricultural subsidies that had kept British farming afloat for decades. The maths on diddly squat was already brutal. He'd tell you himself on camera that the farm made a profit of precisely £144 in its first year. Less than a single decent lunch at his own pub, as it happens. He needed something else, something that could turn a crop into cash without a middleman skimming the difference. So he grew barley, and because barley on its own is a commodity, sold by the ton, at a price he didn't control, to buyers who didn't care whose field it came from, he decided to turn it into beer instead. Beer, unlike barley, has a face on the label. Beer has a story. And Clarkson, whatever else you think of the man, has never once in his career struggled to tell a story. The industry, understandably, didn't take it seriously. Celebrity drinks brands have a very predictable shape. Famous person lends their name to an existing factory, collects a cheque twice a year, turns up to the launch party in a nice jacket, and the actual beer is made by people who've never met them. Everyone in brewing has seen this film before. They assumed Hawkstone would be exactly that, a vanity project that would quietly vanish from the farm shop shelf within 18 months, filed alongside the England football team's chances of winning anything. It didn't vanish, because Clarkson did the one thing none of them expected. He actually built the thing. A proper brewery near Bourton-on-the-Water, with real brewers who knew precisely what they were doing, using barley grown within a few miles of the kettle. When the first batch failed a blind taste test against a well-established local lager, he didn't quietly ship it anyway, and hope nobody noticed. He had it rebrewed. That detail matters more than it sounds. It's the difference between a man chasing a cheque and a man who is, infuriatingly, actually rather proud of what's in the glass. By the time it reached the farm shop in 2021, word had already done what word does in the countryside. It had travelled ahead of the beer itself. Within weeks, it was the best-selling item on Amazon in its category, which is not a sentence anyone in the drinks trade expected to write about a lager made from one man's own barley field. Let's put some proper figures on the table, because vague admiration doesn't win arguments. Numbers do. By 2025, Hawkstone had posted sales north of £21 million. That's not a rounding error for a farm shop sideline. That's 134% growth on the year before, which made it the 23rd fastest growing private company in the entire country. Not the fastest growing drinks brand, the fastest growing company. Full stop. Up against software firms and logistics startups and everything else Britain's economy has to offer. It's now stocked in Waitrose, in Sainsbury's, in Morrison's, and in more than 2,000 pubs across the country. The brewery itself has expanded 3 times in 4 years and now employs 53 people in a corner of Gloucestershire that 20 years ago most of Britain couldn't have found on a map. Its own valuation has climbed to £75 million, and remember that's entirely separate from the farm's £45 million valuation. 2 businesses feeding each other, each one making the other worth more. And here's the number that ought to genuinely worry Carlsberg, Heineken, and every other name on the industrial shelf. Carlsberg made him an offer, reportedly around £50 million, put quietly on the table for the whole operation. Clarkson turned it down within 24 hours, not because the number was too small, because the number was, in a sense, irrelevant. You cannot buy Hawkstone without buying the barley field it comes from, the farmers who supply it, and the man whose face is on the can, genuinely drinking the thing, rather than performing for a photographer. Strip any of that away and you're not left with Hawkstone anymore. You're left with just another lager, and there are already several thousand of those. Then there's the distribution deal that quietly changed everything. In 2023, Hawkstone signed with a major drinks wholesaler, The kind of deal that gets a beer into corner shops and off licenses that would never in a million years have picked up the phone to a small Cotswold brewery directly. Sales tripled within months. Not because the beer got better, because for the first time, ordinary people who didn't live within striking distance of a Waitrose could actually get their hands on a can. And then there was the advert, a campaign in which a chorus of actual farmers sang, with rather more enthusiasm than restraint, about the quality of the beer. The Advertising Standards Authority banned it. Within days, more than 1 million people had gone out of their way to watch the banned advert online, which is, when you think about it, the single most efficient piece of marketing a drinks brand could ever hope to receive, and it cost precisely nothing to make happen twice. Which brings us back to that notice on the shelf in Oxford, because here's the thing that separates a genuine phenomenon from a well-managed marketing campaign. You cannot fake demand outstripping supply. You can fake a queue for a photograph. You can hire extras. You can time a delivery for the cameras. You can manufacture a moment. What you cannot fake is a national supermarket chain having to apologise to its own customers because the beer simply isn't arriving fast enough. That kind of shortage doesn't come from a press office. It comes from a spreadsheet somewhere going badly, embarrassingly wrong, in front of people who are paid a great deal of money to make sure it never does. Hawkstone's range has quietly grown far beyond that first lager too, which is part of why the shortage matters as much as it does. There's a stout now, a cider, a vodka, even a spa lager brewed for the lighter end of the market. An entire shelf's worth of drinks, not just one lucky can. The whole thing is named, rather beautifully, after a Neolithic monument tucked into the Cotswold Hills, which tells you something about a man who could have called his beer almost anything, could have slapped his own surname on it and called it a day, and chose instead to reach 4,000 years back into the very landscape it was grown in. And Waitrose, the very supermarket that had the good sense to be first to stock it, back when this was still considered a slightly eccentric bet by a farmer with a television habit, became the chain that had to put up the sign explaining why the shelf wasn't full. Picture the meeting that must have happened somewhere inside Waitrose's supply chain when that shortage landed. This is a company that plans stock levels with the precision of a military operation, that can keep a shelf of avocados stocked through a global shipping crisis, that forecasts demand down to individual stores and individual weeks. Somebody, somewhere, had to stand up and explain that the reason a shelf in Oxford wasn't full, wasn't a haulage strike, wasn't a factory fire, wasn't anything on their own side of the ledger at all. It was that more people wanted this particular can of lager than a Gloucestershire brewery, however hard it was working, could physically produce in time. That is the moment a farm shop side hustle stops being a story about one man's beer and becomes a story about consumer trust. Because trust in the drinks trade is the one thing you cannot manufacture at scale, however large your marketing budget happens to be. You can build a bigger brewery, you can hire more brewers, buy more tanks, lay more barley fields under contract. You cannot manufacture the feeling that when you crack open a can, you're supporting an actual field rather than a boardroom 3 ownership changes removed from anyone who's ever smelled a hop. The big brewers have spent decades and fortunes trying to buy that feeling with advertising campaigns and celebrity sponsorships. Clarkson got it, more or less by accident, for the price of a farm and a fairly public sense of humour. Now here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because for years the sceptical line on Hawkstone was that it was a southern Waitrose shopper's beer, a treat for people who already knew where the Cotswolds were, ordered by people who'd never set foot north of Oxford in their lives. That line has just quietly collapsed, and it's collapsed in a town most of Britain couldn't place on a map. Up in Crook, a small county Durham town that has absolutely nothing to do with Oxfordshire barley or Amazon Prime documentaries, there's a pub called the Surtees. 12 years it's been open, serving the kind of steady, unglamorous trade that keeps a town's high street alive. The sort of pub where the regulars have their own stools and the landlord knows they're round before they've finished taking their coat off. And the Surtees has just announced a full makeover of its bar and cellar. New fonts, a rebuilt cellar, the whole works. Specifically to make room for Hawkstone on draft. That detail, on draft, matters more than it might sound. A can on a supermarket shelf is a transaction, over in the time it takes to scan a barcode. A pint on draft, in a pub 300 miles from where the barley was grown, is a landlord making a bet with his own money that his regulars will order it again and again and again, week after week, long after the novelty of a celebrity's name on the pump clip has worn off. Landlords do not rip out working beer fonts on sentiment. They do not spend money rebuilding a cellar because a beer looked good on the telly. They do it because the numbers already told them it would pay for itself, and because they'd rather be the first pub in the area pouring it than the last one still queuing for a keg. And it isn't an accident that pubs like the Surtees are getting the chance. Clarkson, rather cannily, offered any pub in Britain 1,000 free kegs, 88 pints each, delivered with no obligation beyond simply being, in his own words, the kind of place he wanted the beer in. It's a landlord's dream and a masterstroke of distribution rolled into one single gesture. Every free keg is a trial. The brewery doesn't have to pay a marketing agency to arrange. Every pint poured is advertising nobody had to budget for, and every landlord who takes one up becomes, whether he planned to or not, an advocate standing behind his own bar. There are now more than 500 independent pubs across Britain pouring Hawkstone, many of them reporting it outselling the big industrial lagers they've stocked loyally for decades. And the geography of that list no longer looks anything like a map of where the wealthy spend their weekends in the Cotswolds. It looks increasingly like a map of Britain itself. Before we go any further, if you're enjoying this one, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us whether you've tried Hawkstone yourself, and subscribe with the bell on so you don't miss what's coming next on this channel. We've got a lot more of Britain's old money, old land, and old money making new money still to come. Now, no honest storyteller pretends this has all been a flawless march to glory, and I'm not going to start now because a story with no cracks in it usually isn't a true one. Earlier this year, the Cotswold Brewing Company had to issue a recall on two of its beers, Hawkstone Black and Hawkstone Spa Lager, after the Food Standards Agency flagged undeclared gluten in the ingredients. Anyone with a wheat or gluten intolerance or celiac disease was told plainly not to drink it and to return the bottles to wherever they'd bought them for a full refund. No questions asked. It is, by any measure, the sort of headline a growing drinks brand dreads more than almost anything else. Food safety notices don't care how charming your marketing is or how good the beer tastes. They land the same way whoever's name is on the label. And in the hands of a company with a shakier relationship with its own customers, a recall like that might have done real, lasting damage to a brand still young enough to be fragile. But watch what actually happened next. The recall notice was blunt, apologetic, and entirely without spin. Customer safety, it said, of paramount importance. We take this extremely seriously. Full stop. Here's a number to call. No corporate waffle designed by a crisis management firm. No burying it 3 paragraphs into a press release nobody would bother reading to the end. Just a straight admission, a clear instruction, and a phone number that actually got answered. And here's the thing about a brand built on the idea that the man on the label genuinely drinks the stuff himself. When something goes wrong, people don't automatically assume the worst. They assume, rightly or wrongly, that a mistake was made honestly and corrected properly, because that's the character of everything else the brand has ever told them, from the barley field to the banned advert to the free kegs handed out to strangers. Compare that to how a distant industrial brewer, 3 ownership changes removed from anyone who's ever actually set foot on a barley field, tends to handle a recall. Lawyers first, honesty somewhere much further down the list, if it appears at all. The stumble didn't break the trust that had taken years to build. If anything, the way it was handled quietly reinforced the very thing that makes Hawkstone so dangerous to the big brewers in the first place. A company still small enough, and still honest enough, to say sorry properly, and mean it. So let's go back to that shelf in Oxford, and that pub in Crook, because now you can see exactly what they add up to. A supermarket that plans its stock down to the tin doesn't put up an apology notice for a beer that's merely doing fine. It puts one up for a beer that's outrunning every forecast anyone had the confidence to write. And a landlord 300 miles from the Cotswolds doesn't rebuild his cellar for a beer that's a passing fad. He does it because his regulars have already started asking for it by name, and he'd rather be first than last. Put those 2 facts side by side, and you get the real headline, the one underneath the joke of a man growing beer in a field because his farming subsidy got smaller. Jeremy Clarkson didn't set out to blow up the brewing industry. He set out to stop losing money on barley. But somewhere between that first failed blind taste test and a shelf going empty in Oxford, he built something the big industrial brewers cannot simply buy their way out of. A beer people trust, from a company small enough to still mean it. That is the announcement. Not a press release, not a launch party, just an empty shelf and a rebuilt cellar, 300 miles apart, both saying exactly the same thing. And that, for now, is where the story stands. Though if the last few years are anything to go by, it won't stand still for long. A man who grew barley because the subsidy check got thinner has ended up with a brewery that supermarkets can't keep stocked and pubs are queuing up to serve. It's the sort of thing that shouldn't happen in an industry as stitched up as British brewing. And yet here we are. If you enjoyed this one, you know what to do. Hit like, leave a comment, and tell us what you make of it all. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss the next chapter of this. Because there's a great deal more to Jeremy Clarkson's empire than a can of lager. The farm, the pub, the running battles with the council, all of it's still unfolding. We'll be back very soon with the next part of the story. Until then, take care of yourselves. And if you do pick up a can of Hawkstone, you'll know exactly what you're holding.